Okay, good afternoon. This is Richard Hsu. I'm co-chair of Shearman and Sterling's Privacy and Data Protection Practice. Today, I'm very pleased and honored to have with me as my guest Professor Joe Grundfest, who's a professor at Stanford Law School. He's also the director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance. I'm very pleased and thrilled to have you. Joe, welcome.
Thank you very much, Richard. Really a pleasure to be here with you.
So, Joe, I know you're obviously an expert on corporate governance, but I want to talk to you a little bit about corporate governance and cybersecurity. And let me start by asking you, when did cybersecurity sort of come onto the scene as something that board of directors need to be concerned about? Or, tell me a little bit about how that has kind of evolved.
Well, this is a situation where crisis preceded action. Boards of directors today are generally fairly aware that every board has a cybersecurity issue. And I think boards began to wake up to this problem about 4 or 5 years ago with some degree of regularity. We at Stanford had sort of pegged this as an issue 7 or 8 years ago. We saw what was coming. We perceived it as being inevitable. And we began teaching cybersecurity issues to members of corporate boards at our Directors College program quite a while ago. And I remember the first year or two that we did it, directors basically came up and said, well, gee, why do I need to know this? To which my response was, just you wait. You'll see.
Now, do you think it's still, of all the things that boards have to think about, is this at the top of the list? Is it, how important is it?
Depends very much on the company. There's some companies where I think it's entirely appropriate to delegate it down to people in the organization, have them report up to the board. Excuse me. There are other corporations where if it's not at the top of the list, I don't know what they're doing. So again, the notion of one size fits all doesn't fit for the cybersecurity issue, just like it doesn't fit for many other issues in corporate America.
When a corporate board member comes to you and looks for guidance on whether they should know about cybersecurity, how do you help them figure that out?
Well, generally, it's a longer conversation. It's impossible to generalize. You'll want to talk to the director about why have they come to me with this question. Typically there'll be a reason why they've come to me, and it'll be anything from idle intellectual curiosity, which is relatively rare, through to I think we've got a problem and I'm not sure we're handling it appropriately at my board, which is more common. And if you're in the latter situation, you really need a longer conversation. You need to say, well, all right, what industry are you in? What's the company working like? What's the reporting structure? Who else is on the board? Where in the corporate entity does the cybersecurity expertise really reside? And what is it about the situation that makes you so uncomfortable that you're asking me a question?
What are some of the minimal things, or what are the things that you think a board member should know about cybersecurity? Is there some sort of minimal level of knowledge that you think is important? What would you say to that?
Well, the answer is individual directors. You can easily run a board where the vast majority of the board knows absolutely nothing about cybersecurity, but you want to have at least 1 or 2 directors who, even if they're not cybersecurity experts themselves, and usually that'll be the case, are at least sufficiently conversant with the issues that they can engage intelligently. And if you have that kind of what I call minimal footprint with regard to cybersecurity, you want to make sure that the board is very competently advised by an outsider that I call a cyber advisor. And I typically recommend that the cyber advisor not be a corporate employee, not be somebody, not be your chief information security officer, not be your chief technology officer, but it be an outsider who is extraordinarily knowledgeable about these issues and can share with the board an objective, unvarnished assessment of the company's position with regard to cybersecurity.
Now, is it really possible for somebody to, if you haven't been in cybersecurity or haven't worked in cybersecurity, is this kind of the kind of thing that it's hard to just sort of, learn on the job, or what's your feeling about that?
It's up there with molecular biology. It's not something you pick up in an afternoon.
Yeah.
And the field is also changing at an extraordinarily rapid pace. The nature of the threats are evolving. The nature of the technologies available to respond to the threats are evolving. notions of best practices. Lots of the defensive maneuvers really have to do with how you organize your operations. Um, all of these are factors that are dynamically changing, and for a large number of boards where you don't really have that level of expertise residing in any individual director, you're going to have to rely on smart outsiders to be good guides for the board.
What about the relation between just knowledge of cybersecurity and obviously a data breach? Obviously, you don't have to have a data breach to be interested in cybersecurity, but tell me about that.
Well, all right, we can now subdivide the information. So, for example, once a problem happens, all right, once you have a data breach and you become subject to a wide variety of different state and federal laws and you're exposed to litigation on many, many different fronts, that's the kind of corporate governance response that boards have to be ready to engage in themselves. I mean, that's standard blocking and tackling. That's crisis management. And instead of an FCPA violation or instead of a blown gas well or what have you, it's a cybersecurity crisis that potentially might involve the leakage of PII, of personally identifiable information. Boards and companies should go through tabletop exercises where they can practice many of the different issues that are going to come up. And the notion of a tabletop exercise as a way for a board to get comfortable with the implications of a breach is extraordinarily helpful. There are many situations where boards go through a tabletop exercise and they realize for the first time how terribly severe the consequences of a breach can be and how the after effects can last for many years, that they sort of roll up their sleeves and they kind of say, gee, we'd rather never have to encounter that situation in the real world. So let's go and look at our cybersecurity defenses and let's see if we're investing enough, if we've got the right people, if we've got the right resources directed against that threat.
How do you compare cybersecurity with all the other sort of corporate board obligations? Is it something that by its nature is sort of qualitatively different, or tell me a little bit about how perhaps it's different from the kind of other obligations that a board member has to think about?
Yeah, I think it's qualitatively different because, for perfectly understandable reasons, a large percentage of corporate directors won't understand the microstructure of the attack. If you have a new product line, it comes out and the customers don't want to buy it, you get that. All right. If you have an oil well that blows up and you're into deep sea drilling, all right, you get that. Even if you're in the mobile phone manufacturing business and all of a sudden your phones start exploding, right? The board of directors gets that. But when somebody comes in and says, gee, we had an SQL insertion and led to XYZ, I mean, many directors are simply, they're going to sit there with their eyeballs rotating in their heads and saying, well, gee, we didn't hash appropriately. What the hell does that mean? And there's a level at which organizations have to figure out how to responsibly run their cybersecurity function without directors who understand the microstructure of these issues.
Well, you seem pretty facile with some of these terms. How did you learn all this stuff? Is that something you also just picked up, or tell me a little bit about your experience with this?
Well, I can be glib. What can I say? And facile is a good word. I wouldn't describe myself as a cybersecurity expert at all. I'm aware of how these issues arise. I'm aware of the problems. I'm aware of the after effects. But, when I sit on a board, I am always looking to, ideally an outside advisor. I think I can ask intelligent questions, but I don't know enough to really get on top of these issues in any sort of an intelligent way.
But when a cybersecurity advisor starts telling you about stuff, are you able to kind of follow along and understand at least at a macro level?
Okay. So, all right. So, sure, I follow it better than many other directors. I get that. But I'm not in a position to really make a lot of these decisions without a lot of advice and hand-holding. And I know that I need help. And in situations where you don't know something, you intelligently go and you get help. So I'm not embarrassed to go and get help if I've got a cybersecurity issue and I don't think I understand everything I need to know about it. And the dangers, I think, in many situations are where you have boards or individual directors who think they know more than they actually do. That's really asking for trouble.
Now, do you think that in terms of the board members who want to know more about, or board members being aware of the situation, do you feel like it's now getting to the point where most people are aware of this, or there's still some distance to go as far as board members needing to understand this in terms of recognizing the importance of cybersecurity, or do you feel like that has kind of reached that point?
Well, I think the vast majority of directors know enough to say the right thing for public consumption. All right. Yes, we take cybersecurity seriously, but then you need to scratch beneath the surface and just say, well, all right, what are you actually doing? All right. Who's got the responsibility? Who's got the knowledge? How are your internal organizations structured? Are you getting help from outside people? Are you testing the systems? What do you do when you find a problem? How prepared are you when the inevitable happens? Because look, cybersecurity in a certain sense is like Russian roulette. And every company, sooner or later, is going to have some kind of cybersecurity issue. It's like the law of large numbers. Mean time to failure on a hard drive. Every roof leaks. How well positioned are you to be able to contain the problem when it happens and to respond appropriately when the problem happens? Because the problem will happen.
Now, are there like 2 or 3 absolute minimal things that a board member should know about cybersecurity in your estimation?
Yeah, that if you turn every computer off, your risks are dramatically diminished. That'll usually work. That'll usually work. That stops the Russians in their tracks. Turn everything off, and you're okay. No, because again, every company is a bit different, and what a director might optimally need to know at an online retailer could be very different from what a director would need to know at a defense contractor or a bank, or a gasoline company. And what you really want to do is sort of understand the context of the problem. Now, that said, there's some very valuable simple pieces of advice that you can pretty much share with most directors that are very, very common, no great insight. And, to me, it's sometimes surprising how many directors kind of go, oh, really? Oh, yeah, okay. So for example, real simple, two-factor, all right? Two-factor authentication. We use it here at Stanford. The companies that I work with, we use it. To me, it's surprising the number of companies that still don't have two-factor authentication, and they say, well, inconvenient, this, that, and the other thing. I kind of go, well, you think that's inconvenient? Wait till you have a breach. Right? Then you'll know what inconvenience really is. So, there's that. Then there's the real simple idea that you should ask yourself, does all of your information really need to be internet accessible? If you want to make sure that a database can't be corrupted, and if it's really extraordinarily important, and that it can't be exfiltrated, then ask yourself, why are these data even accessible over the internet? And if the answer is, well, we want to have our employees able to access it while they're watching the Warriors game on a Thursday night, you say, well, what's the trade-off? You've got the convenience of accessing it over the internet and from home versus the probability of a threat to the crown jewels of the organization. And I think sitting down and taking an inventory of key data and asking yourself, what would be so terrible? What's the cost and benefit calculus of taking some of that stuff off the internet and making it accessible only at the workplace through a hardwired system? Now, that's not going to be a perfect solution. All right? That's not a panacea, and it's not going to work for many different types of applications. And the prevalence and the emergence of cloud computing, where there are tremendous efficiencies of taking certain types of data and putting it up in the cloud so that it can be shared, cuts against this advice, and I get that. But when you're dealing with real mission critical information, I think every company should ask itself, why are these data available on the internet? What would be so terrible if in order to get into this database, you actually had to be in the building at terminals that are wired to access this database?
Now, with all the stuff that's out there about cybersecurity, do you also, in your view, do you also think there's a lot of bad advice running around as well?
I think there's inappropriate advice, and I think inappropriate advice is different from bad advice. And inappropriate advice will have you, for example, spending more money than you need to, spending money on projects that are unnecessary. But again, it's very hard to figure out what really is bad advice in an environment where the expertise is so specialized and you often don't have a large number of people at a corporation who can form a consensus as to what the appropriate response might actually be.
So when a board member comes to you and asks you if they want to learn more about cybersecurity, where do you steer them? I mean, how do they get more knowledgeable? Do you send them to the internet? Do you send them to a class? Do you send them to how do they learn more?
What I typically will do is suggest that they speak with other people who are knowledgeable about these issues. So, and in some cases, I might send them some reading materials, just, standard, the NIST guidelines, good articles that have been written about what boards need to know. There are a few of these pieces that are out there. But often a director will get the information that they need most by talking to another person who's been through that issue. And I'll try to make the arrangements personally appropriate. Like, I'll know someone, these two people will get along.
Yeah.
Right? Or they're from a similar industry.
Yeah.
Or somebody's had that particular issue and they can help out. You want to pay attention to the chemistry as well.
Makes sense. Now, tell me a little bit about how, in terms of all the topics that you look at from a board governance standpoint, where does cybersecurity sit in terms of how much you like the topic? Is it something that's one of your favorites or not so much, or how do you compare that with all the other sorts of stuff that you look at?
To me, it's intellectually fascinating because it raises the question of how does a board govern itself when the board of directors typically has no expertise on an issue that can be extraordinarily important to the organization. And as a matter of formal corporate law, we know that corporations do this all the time, and we know that they're allowed to rely on experts. We know that when corporations do big M&A deals, they'll bring in teams of lawyers, they'll bring in teams of investment bankers. There'll be, big decks, and they get a tremendous amount of advice from these outsiders, and they pay them handsomely. And in many of these situations, you've got a board of directors where nobody on the board has ever sold their company before. Right? So it's the first time they're doing it. People on the other side may have been buying companies for the last 20 years. So the board has a structure for relying on outside advice. It's basically the same situation here as a technical legal matter. But as an intellectual matter, it's how do you get the intelligence and judgment that you need into the boardroom on an issue like cybersecurity so that the decision-making process works well.
Have you written a lot about this topic? Are you writing a book? Have you written a lot of articles?
To this point, I've done more than I've written. And I actually was supposed to have a phone call today with a former student that I unfortunately had to reschedule. We're writing an article about the cyber advisor solution to the cybersecurity problem, and we have some quantitative findings about the fact that cybersecurity expertise in corporate boardrooms is relatively rare. By our calculation, fewer than 5 to 6% of directors have a background that makes it credible that they would have any kind of expertise with regard to cybersecurity, and a very large percentage of the Fortune 500 have nobody on their board of directors. Approximately 2/3 will have no one on the board of directors that has a background suggesting that they're likely to be knowledgeable on cyber issues.
Well, Joe, I really appreciate your taking the time. I've known you for many years, but it's always a pleasure to come and speak with you.
Richard, this has been a thrill. Thank you very much, and feel free to come back anytime you like.
This is Richard Hsu and Joe Grundfest.